I've told this story before, how when I was in college and trying to figure out how to play jazz, and I was playing electric bass at the time, and jazz was new to me, and I was trying to imitate the sounds that I had heard. I remember very clearly sitting in front of my PV amplifier with my bass and trying to work out walking lines. And I just wasn't getting it. It just didn't sort of click for me. And then there was this light bulb moment where I just sort of mistakenly, in a way, played a little line that really opened things up for me. And I remember exactly what it was that I played, in fact. It was... I'm not sure if the very last notes were part of it, but I do remember really turned things on for me. It is different and was different than... It has a very different sort of attitude. That little extra added eighth note, skip note, changed the world for me in that particular moment. And it became second nature. It became something that I used and noticed and listened to for years to come. So I was kind of humbled when a viewer recently sent me a message asking about sort of demonstrating what skip notes are. It sort of occurred to me that this had been covered before, or that everybody almost kind of knew it already, but why would one know that? No one's born knowing this stuff, right? So why not take a second and talk real quickly about skip notes in our walking bass lines. Welcome to Learn Jazz Bass with Matt Rybicki. I'm glad that you're here. We're talking about skip notes in our walking lines today, and it's a very simple concept, and I think it can be very effective. As I said for my story, just being able to use this to imitate the feel opened up a whole world to me. It's a very easy idea. The idea is that you are adding a little bit of extra rhythmic statement in your line to propel it forward, to give it sort of forward motion, to make it interesting. And generally the idea is just that it is an occasional little extra eighth note that is thrown in the quarter note line. That said, there are some things to say about it, I think, that can perhaps be helpful if this is something that you're introducing into your own playing. One of those would be to not overuse this idea. I know this has been said before by other people, maybe not online, but I've definitely heard it from other teachers, like, don't do too much. You know, it completely takes away from the actual walking line. You need to have that steady quarter note thing as the underlying, foundation for what's happening. And we're adding these little extra eighth notes again for interest. You don't want to overdo it in terms of too many, and you also don't want to overdo it as far as overemphasizing the note itself. It's not, or, right? You don't want to sort of make it be the primary part of the line. Although, that said, at certain tempos, you do want to give it some sort of riz, as the kids say, right? You want to give it some charisma, you want to give it some character, some flavor, you want to give it some attitude, because the intention of it is to, again, give a boost, a push, put a hammer down, however you want to say. One way to think about it conceptually is like if you are bouncing a ball on the ground, that eighth note would be where the ball is in the air, right? And the quarter note or the downbeat is down, it's on the ground. But this eighth note is up. And we've also talked about sort of that way of feeling swing where, yes, you have a sort of underlying triplet feel, but the last third of the triplet is emphasized, triplet, and one, and two, and three, and four, and one, like this. So you want that feeling, but you don't want to overdo it too much. It's kind of easiest done at slower or medium slow tempos, but you'll hear almost every bass player do it at some point. Sometimes more than others, and sometimes more subtly than others. Generally, obviously, if a tune is like slower and super heavy swinging, like almost close to like a shuffle, then it might stick out a little bit more. That said, it's tricky. As you can see, I'm sort of fighting to sort of clinically explain this because it is part of this sort of default vocabulary, rhythmic vocabulary of walking, and yet I want to be able to communicate something to you. And so to that end, let me first just sort of display a line, a specific line that I can show you on the screen and play for you, and that we can hear and compare a couple different things. So the line itself, I've got a sort of a D flat bluesy sort of sound almost, is okay? That's the basic line. All right, just that little bit of a snippet. Now what happens if I play those exact same notes, but essentially just double up a few of them? Let's hear the difference. So you'll notice that it has a little bit more movement to it, right? But to me, something isn't quite right. And I think that's because what I'm doing here clinically is just doing sort of the generic idea of just adding an eighth note, right? But it doesn't necessarily always in these 4 bars make the most sense. One way that I think that we can add a little bit more the authentic part of the vocabulary to our own vocabulary is to understand that the nature of the instruments, because of how it's laid out, it's more common to use open strings as the skipped note. And it doesn't matter if they're not in the chord or in the key. That's not the important thing. This is just sort of a device, a tool, an extra little ornament. And so when I'm adding these open strings as the skipped note, it has a different flavor to it. Let's check that out. So I would imagine that might sound a little bit better to you. Now notice I did actually change the notes themselves as well, which sort of lent to, in my opinion, a little bit more of an authentic sort of sound where skips might be involved. That said, there's a lot here for 4 bars. This is sort of too much, but again, I'm just sort of trying to distill it down into a clinical way of communicating the idea. One other sort of level of adding a little bit of what we might often hear from folks is that if you take that skip note and use an open string, but mute that open string, so it just becomes a percussive sound as opposed to a note, then you hear what a lot of people, the way a lot of other people use it. When you are sort of incorporating this idea, I want to encourage you to not get too clinical yourself about how you're doing it. It should come naturally from the sound that you are accustomed to by listening. It should be, it shouldn't necessarily be prescribed. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm choosing exactly where this skip note is going to go in. It's more about feeling and about placing it in an appropriate place based on the musical context. So let's go to using these open strings, same notes as the example before, but now I'm going to mute them so that you hopefully won't hear a pitch at all. Let's check that out. 4. And so hopefully that made a little bit of difference to your ear. It's hard to do this, as I say, not only to communicate it in a clinical way, but it's hard to do it in a clinical way, in a prescribed way. It really occurs more naturally from the experience of listening a lot and transcribing and basically just trying it out and finding places where it works for you. As I say too, in these examples, this is sort of a lot of skipping for just 4 measures. It's a lot, but I'm just trying to distill it down into one particular idea for you. So once again, the idea is to carefully, judiciously, when the moment calls for it, to add in this little extra rhythmic moment. It can be just a percussive sound, it can be a particular note, it can be an open string, and so on and so forth. I find that it can be very effective at the beginning of a big section, like famously in Paul Chambers' Walking Line on So What, when Miles' solo starts, the chord is D minor, and he plays D, 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 There's a skip note right at the beginning on the and of one. It gives that sort of push forward, right? That sort of lift off. That's one good place to do it. And also paying attention to the musicians that are around you and what's happening. If things start to sort of feel soggy or a little bit boring or a little bit bland or just sort of dying down in a certain way, like you don't want to kill it, like, you know, beat people over the head with it. But if it just feels like things are getting a little bit squirrely and not feeling exactly rhythmically as, you know, buoyant as you want, using a well-placed moment of this skip can make a really, really big difference. And it can also add interest when, say, for example, if there's a rest in a solo or a big section of rest while somebody is soloing and the bass is more prominent, then adding this skip can add interest to the line without taking away from the functional element of what we're doing with the walking line. So when there is a little bit more focus on you as the bass player, you don't have to suddenly stop and start soloing. Just adding some interesting little ornaments like this can keep the interest going. So to that end, let me just now randomly play, not randomly, but let me improvise on what is this thing called love. And I'll try to put in some skip notes where I feel that it's appropriate, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense to you in a more musical context than just these clinical examples. So hopefully I didn't overdo it there myself. I'm one to actually overdo it sometimes with that. But there is really, really a great sort of tension that builds when you're trying to actually control it and not actually do it. That I think can be really fun to sort of play with. Like, how long can I stay on these quarter notes and not add some extra stuff just because my hand wants to, but rather because I think it's the appropriate thing to do. So that said, I hope that this was helpful for you, my friend, who asked this specific question about skips, and for you all in general. Thanks so much for joining me today. As always, look below for a link for a free PDF. And always remember, straight ahead and strive for tone.